Good morning, everybody, and happy Thursday. Welcome back to another Facebook Live with the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut. My name is Lauren Pryor, and I'm here this morning on the Indian Rock Nature Preserve inside one of our labs, which has all of our reptiles and amphibians in it from the Barnes Nature Center. And today we are going to be talking about teeth. We're going to take a look at some skulls and talk about the differences between the teeth that herbivores have and how they use them, and the teeth that an omnivore might have and how they use those differences. So we're going to use 3 animals today to check out those differences. We're going to be using the skull of a white-tailed deer, we're going to be using the skull of a beaver, and we're going to be using the skull of a black bear. So all 3 of those animals are found here in Connecticut. They're native to Connecticut. We can start with the white-tailed deer. So the white-tailed deer, I have a skull here, white-tailed deer. We are at the bottom mandible as well. And our white-tailed deer, you can find them in forests, kind of transition areas between forests and fields, areas where there's lots of cover and vegetation. These guys are big eaters. They are herbivores, so they are eating only plants. But they'd like to hang out in those areas of high vegetation for cover and for food. A lot of times we find white-tailed deer hanging out in areas where there's lots of hemlocks, the eastern hemlock. They're eating the hemlock, the bark, and the needles, but they're also using it for cover, because more often than not, the deer, when they're hiding in the hemlock, they can easily see out of the hemlock, where it's very hard for us to see into the hemlock. So next time you're on a trail and you find yourself next to a lot of hemlock trees, try to look deeper into the woods, into the hemlocks. It's harder to do, where if you step off the path into the hemlocks and try to look out back where you were on the trail, it's a lot easier to do. These deer, a lot of the time, they're eating grasses, they're eating acorns in the fall, they're eating twigs and buds in the winter time. So it really depends on the time of year what they're eating. Summer, that's when they're going to be eating all those grasses. So we're going to introduce all 3 of these animals, and then we're going to go back looking at the skull and the teeth. So up next is the beaver. Beaver's pretty common in Connecticut, taking up waterways, ponds, streams, lakes. They're what we call a keystone species in their environment because they make that beaver dam, which kind of impacts the whole local ecosystem. Beavers are also herbivores. So they're making their homes out of those logs and branches, but they're also eating a lot of the branches, bark, twigs, buds. Just because in the water they live in the water does not mean they are eating fish. They only eat plants. Okay, so that's our beaver. We'll come back to the beaver. And then our black bear. So we do have black bears in Connecticut. We do not have grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are much larger. But a black bear is an omnivore, a very opportunistic eater. So they're eating kind of whatever they can get their little claws on or big claws on. So that's going to include insects, ants, larvae, fish, lots of grasses, nuts and seeds, inner barks of trees. We're going to use our black bear skull here to talk about some general parts of the skull before we get into the structure of these animals' teeth and how those teeth let them eat. So I have our black bear skull here. We can take a closer look at it. We'll talk about the types of teeth in just a little bit. We're going to go over the general parts of the skull. Okay, so front and center, we can start with the senses. So front and center with the black bear, we have the nose. The nose would be here. Because this is the skull, we don't have the fleshy portion of the bear anymore, it's just the bone. But when we get a really close look inside that nose, we see all these curly, kind of crunched up bones. Those are called, as part of a system called turbinates, which kind of help filter the air as it comes in through the nose. They're curly and kind of look crunched up in there to increase surface area. So it's a system of the bone and blood vessels that'll help filter air. Lots of mucus in there. Okay. Next part of the skull, we have this circular area. That's where the eye is going to sit. Eyes can be pretty different based on if you're a predator or prey. So we're seeing a bear here, which is an omnivore, so they're eating plants and other animals. They're going to be eating smaller mammals, birds if they can catch them. So their eyes are very forward in the front of their face, so they have depth perception. We'll see how that's different when we check out our deer. Other parts of the skull include the brain cavity, so that hole would lead to the brain. That's where our brainstem would go in. So we have a big space here where our brain would sit. This whole area is not the brain, but our brain would sit kind of just right here. The underside of the skull. That's going to compare to something like our herbivore skull, so we can bring back our white-tailed deer. We see similar features like the system of turbinates, but the eye orbits are much more on the side of the skull. Okay, being a strict herbivore, it's got to watch out for predators. It's not hunting prey, so when this animal is eating grass on the ground, right, when it uses its teeth to rip up grass, it can watch out for predators on both sides of its face as it is eating. Hole towards the brain cavity. We also have two really round bones here. Those are auditory bulbs for hearing. But let's start to talk about their teeth. So, like I said, deer and our beaver are strict herbivores, so they're eating plant matter. So their teeth are going to look a little bit different than our omnivore, our bear skull, and their teeth. So we can bring back the beaver. Again, similar features, the system of turbinates in the nose, hole with the brain cavity, eye orbit spaces, auditory bulbs. So we see a lot of similar features with the skulls, but the teeth are quite different. So our beaver is a very large rodent. So here, we'll bring back the bottom mandible. We have incisors. Those are kind of your front teeth here. So when you are biting into an apple, you're biting into an apple with your front teeth, are incisors. This beaver uses its incisors to crunch and rip up branches, kind of the initial clip off of plant matter. We see a nice orange cover. Beaver teeth, these front incisors of the beaver teeth are outside of the mouth, so the lips can close behind them so they can be active underwater. They're nice and orange. That's a protective coating to make them very strong. It takes a lot of power to chop through trees. Kind of a key feature of herbivores is we're missing those canine teeth. So we have incisors, but then we tend to have a big gap right here before hitting the molars. And our molars here, we can look at our lower mandible. Our molars, they're very square, they're flat. They're going to be there for grinding food and plant matter. Plant matter's tough, so you've got to be able to grind it down. Okay, we can compare our deer. We see very similar features with the deer. We have the incisors on the lower jaw. Those are the initial grabbing teeth. Okay, but with deer, we'll see there's no teeth on the top. Okay, they're not just missing from the skull, there are no teeth there. So deer, they have this gummy hard palate. They don't have front top incisors. They only have the bottom incisors. So when they're eating their grasses, right, they're chewing on the ground and they're ripping and tearing the grass up, and then they're kind of grinding it on top, that hard gummy palate. We see that space just like we had in the beaver before it hits the back molars. Okay, remember the molars, the grasses are tough, so it takes a lot of grinding power to chew it down. And we'll see this feature a lot in our domestic animals. If you've ever been to a farm, you can see it with your sheep and your cows, a lot with having the lower incisors but having that gummy palate up top. You can take a closer look at the molars. Typically, the bigger the animal, the bigger the teeth. So something like a big cow is going to have much thicker molars just because their head is bigger. Where if we were to compare this to a rabbit, okay, another herbivore, much smaller teeth, but similar shape and job, just grinding food. As I have the beaver here, one interesting fact that I forgot to mention is with those incisors, we are missing an incisor here. Since this is a rodent, their teeth continuously grow. So one problem that rodents have out in the wild with their incisors, if they get injured for some reason and their jaw gets broken and knocked off center, well, these teeth are still growing, so eventually these incisors are going to curve around. They're not going to be able to grind down their teeth appropriately. So that's sometimes how we have beavers injure or even kill themselves out in the wild, is that their teeth will grow and then penetrate the eye socket if their jaws are misaligned. So it's very important for those incisors to be aligned with each other instead of off-centered if there's an injury with the jaw. Just an interesting fact about how beavers are rodents, so they do have to trim down their teeth as they're eating their food. But let's bring back our black bear and talk about their teeth and how they're very different, well, not very different, but some differences between the strict herbivore and an animal that is eating plants and other animals. So we can take a look again. You can see if you can spot one big main difference, front and center. And I'll bring up the lower mandible, the lower jaw. Now, one big difference that I hope you notice front and center is the presence of the canine teeth. So with our deer and our beaver, animals that are herbivores just eating plants, they don't need canine teeth. Canine teeth are these big triangular shaped teeth ending with a point. So a bear, being an omnivore eating plants and animals, they need a way to grab and tear meat. We still see the incisors up front, right? So if you as a person, if you're biting into your sandwich or biting into your apple, that's what your incisors are for. The canines, think if you're eating a piece of meat jerky, it's tougher, you've got to be able to rip and tear it. Same with these canine teeth. They're for biting, holding on to that prey item, ripping and tearing. Okay, and then of course this animal is going to eat and chew, and then it's going to hit the back molars, something they have in common with the herbivores, to be able to grind up that food into smaller chunks so it can be swallowed. We also see very large bone structures here. This is where a lot of muscles are going to attach to the jaw of the bear to allow strength in that bite. Those canine teeth are pretty big. If I hold up my thumb, okay, that's how we can compare in size. Probably about 1 inch long. Bears right now are resting for the winter. They're sleeping in their dens, so they bulk up a lot during the summer and fall to get a lot of fat reserves in order to sleep through the winter, but they can wake up pretty easily in the winter time if they're disturbed. Their dens are going to be, they can be in caves, but they also might be dug out under brush piles or in banks. And they should be waking up and starting to be active again come March and April. But it's really going to depend on how fast it warms up. Okay. So there are 3 common species that we find in Connecticut, and some differences between their skulls, their teeth, depending on what they're eating. So for a quick review, we have an herbivore, an animal that's eating just plants, our white-tailed deer. We see incisors for initially grabbing food. We see an absence of canine teeth, so that we don't have any sharp pointing teeth, but we do have square molars for grinding and chewing down and breaking down that plant matter so it's easier to digest. Key feature to a deer skull or any herbivore skull, if you find a skull out in the wild and you're not quite sure what it is, look on the eye position. So we have eyes on the sides of the head, indicating a prey species. We've got our beaver, again an herbivore, eating trees, bark, twigs, branches, leaves, as well as using those materials to make its home, its beaver dam. We see an incisor, strong incisors, the orange coating for protection, signature gap before hitting the back molars. And then difference between an animal that's eating plants and meat, an omnivore, we now see the canine teeth for ripping, grabbing, biting, tearing meat. So if you find yourself walking in the woods or you're in your backyard and you find an animal skull, because out in the wild where animals are living, they will die out there, so it is possible to find animal skulls out in forests, in your state parks, your public parks. So if you come across an animal skull, those are key features you want to look out for. That's going to help you narrow down what animal it is depending on what it's eating. So thanks for joining us today at the Environmental Learning Centers of Connecticut on our Facebook Live. We're going to be back on Tuesday, back at 10 a.m. to 10:20. If you have an environmental topic that you're interested in, you can always let us know by commenting below on the video, and we'll be sure to cover it for you. But thanks for tuning in this morning, and we hope to see you again next Tuesday.